So let's make sure we see the shop screen after we logged in. Now there are two possible routes we could take. One route is that if you did log in or did sign up successfully, so basically here inside the try block, you actually use navigator of context and then maybe push replacement, and then you go to your products overview screen, which right now isn't registered as push replacement named, which right now isn't registered as a route, but of course we could add it here to our routes table. We could add our products overview screen here to the table and then navigate to it with push replacement named so that we leave the off screen and we're in the shop. Would work, no problem with that, but it has one major downside. It would mean that we always start on the off page when we open the app, and we have to log in so that we are then forwarded to the shop page. That's not really what I want to do. So the better approach might be to change the home page we have here in the main Dart file. Now that might sound strange, but keep in mind that Material app is also a widget, and that in the My app here, we're also in a widget with a build method. So we could say that if we log in, this build method should maybe rerun, because logging in and logging out is a big change that should affect the entire app. So this will then rerun, and if it reruns, it will rebuild the Material app. And if we then switch the home screen and switch that from off screen to products overview screen, then for that rebuild after the login, we would automatically render a new screen without navigation, simply because this was rebuilt and now renders a different screen into our face, so to say. And that's actually the approach I want to use here, because that will later allow us to implement a check here when the app starts for whether the user is authenticated or not, and then always send us to the right screen right from the start. So the goal is to switch this home screen we render. Either our home screen is the products overview screen if we are authenticated, or it's the off screen if we are not. And if we initially are not authenticated, and then we do authenticate, that's no problem. We just have to ensure that this build method runs again, and then here we use some if condition to switch the screen we're showing. That's the idea. So how does this work in detail then? Well, since we set up our auth provider here, and that is in the end managing the object where we do manage that whole login stuff and so on, since we're doing that here, it would make sense that we actually don't rebuild this entire method here maybe, but this part of the tree. And for that, we can of course use the consumer, which is part of the provider package and which I showed you in the state management module of the course. So we'll not entirely rebuild the entire widget tree, but we will rebuild the Material app. And that of course is what counts here. So here we have our consumer, and we consume our auth class, or the nearest auth object we can find, which is of course the object provided here. And consumer now takes a builder here, and that builder receives a context which is given to the build object in there, and gets your auth object, your auth data, whatever you want to name it. I'll just name it auth. And you also get this child widget if you had some static part which you don't want to rebuild. Now here, however, I have no child, so I'll just add a blank here to indicate that there is nothing I would want to pass in as a fixed widget, so to say. Now the thing I want to return here is my Material app. So let's grab the Material app here and move it into this builder function right here. So now this ensures that the Material app is rebuilt whenever auth changes, whenever that auth object changes, and whenever we call notify listeners in there, which we right now, by the way, are never doing, but we'll soon add that. So whenever that changes, this builder runs again and gives us a new Material app. In there, we get access to the latest auth object, and therefore we can use it down here when we decide what our home page, our home route should be. And here we can therefore check auth, and now what? Now we need some getter or some property on the auth object, and therefore in the auth class, that tells us whether the user is authenticated or not. So let's go to the auth Dart file, and up there I'll add a new getter which should return a boolean, which I'll simply name isAuth, because that is what I want to return here. And we can have a very simple rule here. If we have a token and the token didn't expire, then the user is authenticated. So here we can add our logic for checking the expiry date. and comparing it to the current date and see if the current date is still behind the expiry date, so the expiry date hasn't passed yet, and if the token is set. Since we'll later also need the token itself, I'll create another getter here, which actually returns the token. So here, token without an underscore. Here it is with an underscore. And there I check if underscore expiry date is not null. If it's null, then we can't have a valid token. And if it's not null, if expiry date, and now the cool thing is on date here we can call is after. And here I want to check if it's after now, because if it's after now, then it's valid. So if we have an expiry date and it hasn't passed yet, so it's in the future, then I will return underscore token. Actually, we should also add one other check here. We should check if token is not null. Because if the token is null, we also have a problem. But if the expiry date is not null, and it's in the future, and the token is not null, then we return the token. Otherwise, and please keep in mind that with return, you finish this execution, you won't reach the next line if you return here. So we only reach that line if we don't make it into if. So otherwise, I'll return null as a token. Now here in isAuth, we can now use our token getter and find out if that is null, because we have all the validation logic in here, the local validation logic, I should say. So if this here returns null, we know we're not authenticated because we have no token or a token that already expired. So here we return token unequal to null. Only if it's not equal to null, we are authenticated. If the token is equal to null, then we are not authenticated. So this is the getter, and now we can use that getter in the main Dart file here. On Auth, we can now call isAuth, use that getter, and if that is true, I of course want to render the product's overview screen. If it's false and we're not authenticated, then I want to allow the user to log in or to sign up with the Auth screen. That's the logic there. Now, of course, we'll have to do some work in the Auth Dart file in the providers folder though, because right now we're never setting the token or the expiry date. And of course, we have to set this, otherwise this will always be false. We never will have a token. We have to set this here in underscore authenticate in this method. There we get our response, and here we have the response data. We're checking the response data for errors. What we're not doing is when there is no error in the response data. So if we're not throwing an exception here, then of course I want to log my user in. I want to set my token, store the token here in memory and so on. So here I want to set underscore token equal to response data and then ID token, because remember that on the Firebase response, you actually would get back an ID token field which contains that token. So we're extracting the ID token from the response we're getting here. We also want to set our user ID. So underscore user ID should be equal to response data, and then it's the local ID field here. And you can see that in the official docs too, local ID is the ID of the user. Now the expiry date is also something I want to set. The expiry date here, of course, has to be calculated, because the only thing we get back is expires in, which only contains a string, but in its string we have the number of seconds. So we'll have to parse that string and turn it into a number, but then after turning it into a number, we have to derive a date from that. So expiry date should be a datetime object, and there we can take the current timestamp, and now we only have to add this amount of seconds it takes until the token expires, right? Because current time plus amount of seconds until it expires gives us the timestamp when it will have expired. So we take the current timestamp, and then we can call the add method, which the datetime object conveniently gives us, and pass a duration into that. Duration is a class provided by Dart to express, well, durations. And here we want to set a duration in seconds, because we're getting a duration in seconds. And the duration in seconds now is response data expires in with a capital I. So this key here, but keep in mind that's a string. Here, however, seconds takes an integer. So we need to transform that into an integer, otherwise we'll get an error later. So here we should call int parse and wrap response data expires in into that int parse call here. With that, we're now setting this duration here with our parsed seconds and add this to the current timestamp to derive the expiry date. And with that, we're storing that data which we need. Now with all of that, we can call notify listeners here to update our user interface, which we of course have to do to, for example, trigger that consumer here. Let's give it a try. Let's do a full refresh here. And now let's try logging in with one of the users we created earlier. So here I'll reuse my dummy data like this. Press login. See the spinner. And that's looking good. We're in the shop. We still can't load the products, and that's normal because we know now that we're logged in. We know that in our app here, but we're not telling the server. We're not attaching the token to the requests we're sending to the server. So that's, of course, the next step. Make sure that we use that token, which we do manage here in our auth Dart file, that we use that token to also send it to the server so that we're not the only one who knows that we're logged in.